Good to be with all of you today. Is this thing working? Nope. There we go. That's better. Ooh, that's pretty hot. Uh, Good to be with all of you. I feel like it's been a while since I've been here. I'm gonna turn that down for a second and let Andy go. I'll switch to this until Andy turns that down because I don't want to have to listen to that feedback the whole time that I'm speaking. Uh, this morning, we're continuing in our Lenten series, Change from the Inside Out. As we have gone through our planning for this year and even into next year, we've kind of decided that change from the inside out is kind of the theme for this whole year. There we go. That's better. All right. It's kind of the theme for this whole year, right? That's why we're doing the 5x5, deepening our discipleship, right? Is that we're working on ourselves, on our own personal discipleship this year, on our own internal workings, so that next year we can start turning our focus outward, right? We know that our mission as a part of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples for Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And a thing that we don't talk about often is making disciples and transforming the world, right? It's a thing that we've been talking about as Eric, as he's doing some of this, the work that he's doing with our strategic planning. Sorry. Well, not the gatherings, actually. Some of the strategic planning that he's doing and leading some of those conversations and focus groups. He's realized that nobody talks about those things, which is a data point in and of itself, right? It's some information that I think is fairly important. So that's kind of like why we're doing all of this work, right? So that we can deepen our own personal discipleship, our walk with Jesus, but also so that we can start to have a true impact on our community, right? So this week, our emotion is embarrassment, right? We all love to feel embarrassed, I'm sure, right? Isn't it our favorite? No, it's terrible. But our scripture comes to us from John chapter 12, verses 1-8. And it's the story of Mary anointing Jesus with oil. Now, this story occurs in all four gospels, which there aren't very many stories that that's true of. Okay. So that means it must be somewhat important if it occurs in all four of the Gospels. But if you can see here on this chart, it looks different in all four Gospels. There's different details, right? So for three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, it occurs in Bethany, but Luke says it occurs in Galilee. In Matthew and in Mark, it occurs at the home of Simon the leper. Simon the Pharisee in Luke, and in John, it's the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. In Matthew, in Mark, it's just an unidentified woman. In Luke, it's a sinful woman. And then in John, it's Mary. He's anointed in different places. So in Matthew and Mark, he's anointed on his head as a king would have been. But in Luke and John, his feet are anointed. An ointment of some sort is used in all four. Mark is specific that it's an ointment of nard. In Luke, it's the woman's tears and the ointment. And John is the ointment of nard. It doesn't say anything about it being dried in Matthew and Mark, but Luke, it's mixed with the woman's tears, and she uses her hair to dry the ointment on his feet. Mary also in the Gospel of John uses her hair to dry the ointment. In Matthew, the disciples object. In Mark, it's just some people, whoever that is. In Luke, it's Simon the Pharisee, though he doesn't object because of the cost. And then in John, it's Judas who objects because of the cost. Have you all ever paid attention to the way that this story is told in four different ways? No, because when we start to recount and remember the stories, we kind of start to blend everything together because certain details and certain stories stick in our brain. And so we just remember it as one story and we don't pay attention to the different details that different authors include, right? So just some interesting things for you to carry with you. But this story is also interesting because it's surrounded by death. So in John chapter 11, that's when Jesus raises Lazarus. So if you remember, Jesus is far away. He's with the disciples, teaching, healing. People come to him and say that Lazarus is sick, and Jesus is like, "Yeah, it's fine. Uh, it's not a big deal." Like he just kind of blows it off and seems very kind of calloused and says it's going to be for the glory of God. He finally, after like 3 days, decides he's going to go and see Lazarus. And when he gets to the edge of town, people let Mary and Martha know that he's coming. And so Martha runs out, is like, "If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And Mary is angry at Jesus, right? She's, can't believe that he hasn't shown up uh, earlier than this to save her brother. Martha is, kind of saying the obvious when he's going to the tomb and tells them to open it up. And he's, "Lord, he stinketh." I think I taught a lesson about that before. So he raises Lazarus up, but then after this happens, right, word gets back to the leaders. Then they're like, "That's it. We've got to get rid of this guy." So they start to create a plot to kill Jesus, right? Then Mary anoints Jesus at the beginning of chapter 12. And then right after this, there's a plot to kill Lazarus, right? So people are trying to stamp out uh, the new life that Jesus has brought to the world already. So John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So as we'll see, this story is kind of cast in the light of the Last Supper that Jesus had with the disciples. The word that's used for dinner here is the same word that's used to describe the Last Supper, which is used exclusively in those two places. Okay, so it's kind of uh, making those two things rhyme, or bringing them together. Lazarus also is described the same way that the disciple whom Jesus loved is described at the Last Supper, reclining at the table with Jesus. The word that's used for wipe when Mary wipes Jesus' feet with her hair is the same word that's used to describe Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Okay, which kind of casts that in a different light when you just think about when you put those two things together, right? It's also interesting, right, that the house, it describes the house as being filled with the fragrance of the perfume, which if you put a pound of a fragrant perfume on somebody's feet, that's going to have a pretty strong smell, right? Um, but through this act, one of the commentaries that I read said, through Mary's act, the stench of death that once lingered over the household is replaced by an act of love and devotion, right? uh, she's preparing him for burial, but also this love and devotion for the new life that Jesus has brought. So continuing in verse 4, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. So the word for thief here is the same word that's used in John chapter 10 to describe the one who threatens the flock, right? So not only is Judas, dishonest and a thief and kind of seems to be greedy, according to John, right? He's also cast as a threat to Jesus and those faithful followers of Jesus. And finish up. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." So we're going to get into that last verse there because that can be kind of controversial in Christian circles sometimes and used in very interesting ways. So what's interesting about the way that Mary, Lazarus, and Martha are cast in this text, right, is they're kind of a model of discipleship, right? Martha is described as serving. Lazarus is reclining at the table with Jesus. As I mentioned, that's the way that the disciple whom Jesus loved is described, the Last Supper. And Mary anoints Jesus's feet with oil, which has ties to Jesus, the washing of the way that Jesus washes the disciples' feet. It's an extravagant gift, right? It's can be seen as wasteful, maybe because she's pouring out a pound of expensive oil and ointment on his feet. But by doing that, right, she's preparing him for burial because we know that Jesus is about to die. Um, but it's also a way that a king would have been anointed as like when he becomes king, except that a king would have been anointed on his head, not on his feet. So it's kind of playing into this unexpected Messiah theme that we see in the Gospels, right? That people have this very distinct understanding of who the Messiah is going to be, somebody that's going to come defeat their enemies, aka Rome, and restore the kingdom of Israel as it used to be. And that's not who Jesus is, and that's not what Jesus does. And he's not even anointed in the right place, right? And so it's really leaning into that kind of tradition of the unexpected Messiah. But also, Mary is practicing the commands of Jesus before Jesus has even given them, right? If you remember in the Last Supper, when Jesus washes the disciples' feet, he also commands them to wash each other's feet. And so Mary is putting that into practice, right? That extravagant service to one another before Jesus is even given that command, right? She's giving this extravagant gift of love as well before Jesus has even given the command to his disciples to love one another. And so I don't think that we use Mary as a model of discipleship, but maybe we should, right? Because she has had this experience with Jesus where she has witnessed him give new life, right? To transform her pain, and it transformed her, right? And so her response is her devotion and love and service to Jesus, and she's responded, right, in an extravagant way in her life. Right, all three of them, these siblings, are serving in their own way, right? We just get more description as to Mary's extravagant gift of service. So you will always have the poor with you. Have y'all heard that said? Have y'all heard this phrase before? Anybody got any want to share how they've heard it used or maybe used it themselves? Or do we just not talk about it very much? Or are we too scared to say the ways that we've heard it used? Because it gets used in some pretty not great ways, if we're being honest, right? Because Judas really isn't wrong, right? This would have been a year's wages, so that could have it's not an insignificant amount of money. But Jesus doesn't care about the waste at all, right? It that could have had a great impact, right? If you're working at a nonprofit organization and somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I got $60,000 I want to give you," you're going to drop everything that you have and you know start working with that person so that you can receive their funds because that's going to make an impact. Um, Jesus doesn't seem to care about the extravagance of the gift at all. Um, but he also isn't letting us off the hook for uh, caring for the poor, which is kind of the way that this is worded, right? It's used oftentimes as like, well, the poor are always going to be here, but I'm not going to be here. So forget about the poor for a while and just worry about me. Would y'all agree? Is that what it sounds like? Or am I making this up? It's what it sounds like. Some of y'all are like, he's setting us up. Um, And people use it that way, right? There, you can walk into churches and pastors and other Christians, and you'll hear people say that our we should be focused more on our own faith and spiritual growth more than we should focus on caring for the poor, because Jesus said that the poor will always be with us, but he won't be. Okay, I don't think that's what Jesus is saying here, because Jesus is pretty clear that it's important for us to take care of the poor, right? He, even in other parts of the Gospels, equates caring for the poor with loving God. Okay. Um, so if we're really looking at this, and it really, as oftentimes, gets into translation issues, right? Maybe that we're reading this wrong, because indicatives and imperatives often look the same in Greek. Okay. Um, so where it says you will always have the poor with you, maybe it's supposed to be read as keep the poor with you always, which is very different when you translate that to English. And I don't know that we do a very good job of keeping the poor with us always, right? This is also alluding back to the commandment to care for the poor in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 11. But yeah, the poor are not always with us, and we are not always with the poor, even though that's a command that Jesus gave us, right? And so as we think about discipleship and our own personal discipleship, right, why is it that we are not with the poor and the poor are not with us? Right? What are the things that are preventing us from being in those kinds of spaces, right? Have y'all seen the gentleman that hangs out with me on Wednesday nights? His name is David. He pushes a shopping cart around Dunwoody. Um, you know, he's homeless. He lives here in Dunwoody. He probably is either on the spectrum or has some sort of learning disability. Not exactly sure what his situation is, but I've been just kind of building a friendship with him, trying to get him to trust me, trying to figure out if we can get him into some resources and help him, get his life back on track and get him off the street. But it's pretty frustrating sometimes, because on Wednesdays he gets here around 3 o'clock, if he remembers that he's can be here at 3 o'clock. And I let him take a shower downstairs because there's no kids. There's not a lot of people in the building at that time. And then we go upstairs and we'll have dinner. We'll sit in here and have dinner, and, get him a to-go meal. But, there are days where he shows up at 4 o'clock, which is when all the kids get here. And I'm like, no, man, you can't take a shower. You got to get here at 3. And so then he kind of pouts, like an 8-year-old would, because he wants to take a shower. And then, he just, it makes my life more frustrating, because I'm trying to walk with him, and he's not on the same level as me a lot of times. But there are days where I just want to be like, dude, don't come back here anymore. Go figure it out yourself. Right? But in the back of my brain, I hear Jesus saying, anything that you have done for the least of these, you have done also for me. Right? And I'm not trying to make myself look better. I'm just trying to say that, like, it's frustrating and it requires sacrifice, right? If we are really going out and trying to serve other people, it's going to put us in situations that are uncomfortable, right? When we don't have all of the answers, and we have to try to find other people and resources in ways to learn how to help somebody, and also draw boundaries of, like, I can't help you with that. I'm sorry. This is what I can and cannot do, right? And so oftentimes what we see is that when we start to get into places that make us uncomfortable, we kind of start to pull back, right? Because we're like, I'm out of my depth. It's not my thing. But it's in the places where tension is created in our lives, where we get a little bit uncomfortable, or we feel like we're a little out of our depths, where God really starts to do good work. And so in the moments in my life when I have been the most uncomfortable, and allowed myself to just kind of sit in that and see and experience it and see what God does, I have learned and grown the most. And in situations where I have turned the other way and gone back to my comfort, I have not grown at all. So that's just something for us to think about as we continue throughout this year into this journey of discipleship and being changed from the inside out. So we'll get to our questions. So what makes you feel embarrassed, right? If you think about from Mary's perspective, it might have been kind of embarrassing to just in the middle of a dinner party to pour out a whole bunch of expensive perfume on somebody's feet and then get down and wipe it with your hair. And so, what is it that makes you embarrassed? We all have little things, big or small, in our daily lives that make us embarrassed. Who are you modeling your discipleship after? I think Eric has talked about some of this with y'all about who's pouring into you and who are you pouring into, right? Who are the people that you look to for guidance in your lives? How has Jesus transformed you? I'm assuming that if you're sitting in this room, at some point in your life, you've had an encounter with Jesus that made you say, hey, I want to follow that dude because like you had something that is compelling, that transformed you, that healed something or saved you from a certain situation, right? So how has Jesus transformed you? Does living out your faith ever make you feel embarrassed? I don't know that we always think about it that way, but I think it's sometimes this might feel like a more appropriate question for a high schooler, right? Because you want to fit in with the crowd in high school and you don't want to be the one talking about Jesus all the time and not listening to the popular music or whatever, right? But I think it's true for adults too, because there are all these things. I want to do a sermon series about this sometime, but there's all these things that we teach children that adults don't actually practice. Things like sharing and telling the truth, right? Just saying. Right. But I think if we're honest, right, there are things that we could do to be a better disciple, to live out our faith better in our daily lives that we don't because we're worried about what people might say or how it might look or how it might make us feel in the moment because we might stand out. So are the poor with you, right? If they're not, why aren't they? Why aren't you with the poor? So there's, softball or two in there, get you warmed up, and then some heavier hitters. But that's all I got. Discuss.